Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we will be creating the actual URL shortener functionality within our application. This is going to be quite a bit of work, so let's get started. First things first, we're going to be working in our App.js file, and we'll add the basic code that will actually register, or basically make it so that our code in other files will work, allowing us to split our application into other files so that it isn't one long file. We'll also delete or comment out this get request for the hello world from last time, as we don't need that anymore, and in the next episode we will be editing that so that editing another file that uses that, so we don't want to cause a conflict. Firstly, as we will be dealing with returning JSON information when they send us a request to shorten a URL, we need to make our app use, or basically utilize, Express's built-in JSON parser. To add this, we use the following code: app.use express.json extended false semicolon. Basically, app.use tells our Express app what middleware we want to use when parsing the requests sent to it / returned by it. The JSON one here allows us to send and receive JSON data, as it will be parsed by the middleware we just told it to use. Next, we will add our routes section, or our routes. So / routes, which basically are other files that will handle the requests similar to our route that returned hello world. Currently, just they'll be handled in other files. In this part, we will basically import the files that will handle the aforementioned routes. To do that, we can import const base route equals require / routes / base, and const API route equals require / routes / API. We will create these actual files later in the episode. Now we will code the routers, which basically allow us to actually use the routes here that we create in other files, and assign them a directory such as /API, and assign that to the API route. Therefore, if we have a / or base route in the API route folder, it would actually be http://localhost 3000 /API, rather than just localhost 3000 /. As with this, it prefixes what we choose in the stage to any of the routes in the file. The two we will be handling here will be /API and the base root of /. So, and to register them, we do app.use / base route is the one that will handle that, and app.use / API route is one that will handle that. And that is all we need to do for this episode in this file specifically. We'll now move on to developing the model of storing our shortened / target URLs in our MongoDB database. To do this, we can create a file in models named shorturls.js. And we can open the file. In this file, we will make a model which is basically a blueprint of how we will store data in the database. Our model will have two components: a target URL, which is the URL that the shortened link will redirect to, and the short ID, which is the ID which will be assigned to that target URL. To actually create the component, we need to use the following code. We first need to import Mongoose, as we are using the Mongoose schema object. So const mongoose equals require mongoose. Now we actually create the model. Both fields will be of the type string and will also be required. If we don't provide them, the program will error, which is what the required section means. Const short URL schema equals new mongoose.schema so target URL type of string and required is true. And then short ID type string required true. The final thing that we need to do is to actually export the model so that we can use it in other locations of our code. We will export it with module.exports. The first section of the mongoose.model, so module.exports const short URL equals module.exports equals mongoose.model short URLs, comma, short URL schema. The first section of mongoose.model right here is the actual table name of where this will be stored in our database, so short URLs. The second part here is the actual schema. Now that we've created our database model, we can finally move on to adding the functionality to shorten the URL. The first thing that we will do is write the code to actually shorten the given URL. We do this in the API root, which, as we mentioned before, will be in the root api.js file, which we need to create. So let's just right-click, create file, and name it api.js in the routes folder. New file, api.js. In this file, there are 4 things that we need to import. The router, which is basically what we created in our app.js file, and it allows us to basically treat this as a sub-portion of the Express app, kind of in its own little section of the router, of the app and the router. This is what we will also export to be used in app.js. Const router equals require express.router. Now we'll import 2 of the packages that we installed. Short ID, which will actually create the ID they will use to navigate to their shortened URL, and valid URL, which will check to see if their inputted target URL is actually a valid URL, and isn't just a random string that they entered. Therefore, our program won't error when we redirect them. Const short ID equals require short ID, and const valid URL equals require valid URL. The final thing that we will import is our database model that we just created, as we will use that in our code to save and retrieve the shortened URLs. So const short URLs equals require /models/short URLs. Now, at the bottom of the file, we can add the export section so that we can export the router out of this file so that we can actually utilize it in app.js. So module.exports equals router. Pretty simple. We can now add a simple GET request handler on the base route of the API router, which, if you can remember, means that it will be localhost 3000/API rather than localhost 3000/. This handler is used to basically send back a forbidden status code, an information page, so that if anyone navigates to /API, it won't tell them anything. This is completely useless, but I like doing it, so if you don't want to do this, just skip ahead a few seconds. Note that we use router instead of app, as we do not have an app variable in this file. So above the module.exports, router.get quote slash rec, res arrow into res.status 403 dot send h1 for header forbidden slash h1 semicolon. Now we can actually add the route that will handle shortening the given URL. I will go through the following code as I type it, reading the comments I put in. So router.post slash URL slash shorten. So that'll be slash API slash URL slash shorten. Async rec, res. We use .post because the user will be sending a post request to the server, which basically indicates that it's sending data. We also make it an async function as we use the database, so we need to await info from it. The target URL is the URL they want to shorten. We get it from the body of the post request that they sent us. So var target URL equals rec body target URL. Var base URL equals process.env.base URL or http://localhost 3000. This is simply the base URL section in our .env file, which we use to send back the generated URL. Now we can move on to the next section. If not valid URL, which if you remember was the package from above, .is URI base URL. So here we are using the imported valid URL package to check if our base URL is actually a valid URL. If it is not, hence the exclamation mark, that's the opposite of what this is. So if this is true, we want it to not continue, whereas if it's false, we want to continue. We send back an error status and tell them that the base URL is invalid. So res.status 400.json base URL is invalid. In the next section, we check if the input valid target URL is actually valid. If it is, we continue to shorten it. Otherwise, we send back an error and say that it isn't valid. So if valid URL dot is URI target URL, and then we say else res.status 400.json target URL is not a valid URL. And then we can continue up above. So here we use a try and catch block to make sure that if the database sends us an error when we try to do something, that our code doesn't break if it sends an error, but rather that it just prints out an error and sends one back to the user. So try catch error and console.log error internal error shortening URL /n error. That's using template literals, which is discussed I believe 2 episodes ago. No, last episode. So now we can go back up and we can continue. So back in the try part, we check if they sent us an ID that they want to use as the ID for the URL. Basically, if they send us a custom one. If they do, we continue to shorten the URL with that ID. Otherwise, we create our own in the other sections. If rec.body.short ID, then we do that. Else we do this. So in here, we check if there is already a shortened URL with the same ID in our database. We use find one on the short URLs object and supply the parameters so it will find only one if there is one in the database. Otherwise, it will be undefined or null. So var already exists equals await short URLs dot find one short ID rec.body.short ID. So down here, if it already exists, we tell the user, otherwise we continue shortening it. So if not already exists, the reason why we have to do not is because it will only return it. It will only have something if it does exist. So if it doesn't exist, we continue making it, otherwise we tell them else. So res.status 49.json the requested ID is already in use. Return. So if it doesn't already exist though, we can continue. So the ID is set to the provided one. So shortened ID equals rec.body.short ID. We create a string using template literals, that is the URL they would need to visit to be redirected. I don't use this in the tutorial, but you could easily send this as well back to the user so they know what URL to visit rather than just giving them the ID. So we say let generated URL equal backtick money sign base URL / money sign shortened ID. In the next two steps, I create a new entry into the database supplying both the target URL and the ID, and I save it into the database. So URL equals new short URLs where target URL is target URL and shortened ID. And short ID is shortened ID. Now we save it. So await URL.save. Now here we send back a created code as we created the URL shorten URL, and we send back the URL object which contains both the target URL and the shorten ID. You do not have to send this back, but could rather redirect them to another page where you display the generated URL. But for the sake of the tutorial, this is all I'm doing. So res.status 201.json URL and return. Now in here, in the other else, from if they didn't have the short custom ID, this is where we shorten the URL and create the ID if the user did not supply a custom one. Firstly, we check to see if there is already an ID for the specified URL, similar to above. So var URL equals await short URLs dot find one target URL is the target URL. So we're trying to find one by the specific URL. If there is already an ID, we send that back to them with the OK status. So if URL res.status 200.json URL. Otherwise, or else, if one doesn't already exist, we create a short ID with the imported package, and we store that in this variable. And we also create the generated URL the same way as above. Basically, though, if it already exists, we send them back the ID so they can use the same ID, meaning that we don't have to repeat a URL in the database. Up here is the only time we don't want to create one if it already exists, because we can't have two custom ones that go to different URLs. So yeah. So var shorten ID, then shorten ID equals short ID dot generate. And now we can also do the same thing as up here where we create generated URL. So we say let generated URL equal base URL slash shorten ID. Here, we also create the entry in the database and save it, and we send back the created status and the URL object. So URL equals new short URLs with target URL as target URL and short ID as shortened ID. Now we can save it as well. Wait url.save and send it back. So res.status 201.json URL. And yeah, so once we have completed that section, we can move on to the base route section, which will be the last router of this video. We need to create the router file the same way as API.js. So in routes, we can create a file named base.js, a new file, base.js, and open it. Firstly, we can import the required packages and can export the router so it can be used in App.js. The first thing we need to import is similar to API.js, which is the router. So const router equals require express dot router. Then we import the short URLs model so we can access the database, and we also import the path package, which is pre-installed with Node.js. We'll be using the path package in the next video, but we'll not be using it in this video. So const short URLs equals require // model / short URLs and const path equals require path. We will also go to the bottom of the file and we'll export the with module that exports the router for use in other files. Module that exports equals router. Now we can move on to adding the actual GET request handler that will redirect the user to their desired target URL. So router.get /:id, async rec res arrow into curly brackets. So the :id after the slash right here indicates that this will handle requests on the base route that have something after the slash, and will take those in as parameters, allowing us to take the supply ID and check our database for it. This also needs to be async as we will be querying the database. So in here, we will make a try catch block as we will be dealing with the database, so this is in here in case something goes wrong. So try catch error, and then in here we log the error to the console and send the user info telling them there wasn't a server error. So console.log error retrieving by ID /n error, and res.status 500 JSON internal error. Back in the first section, in here, we query the database to see if it has an entry that matches the given ID from the user. We use rec or request.params.id to get the parameter from the request, aka the :id from above. Var URL equals wait short URLs find one short ID rec.params.id. Now we check if we actually found an object in the database that had the given ID, and if we do, we redirect the user using res.redirect to their desired website. If we could not find it by the given ID, we inform the user that there are no URL entries with that given ID. So if URL, then return res.redirect URL.target URL, else we res.status .json no URL with the given ID found. And actually we'll be returning that as well. Return. And that's it. We now have a working URL shortener, which we will now proceed to test. To test it, we can start the server with npm run go in the command line, and once we've done that, we can return to VS Code to send a request. So cmd cd desktop cd NodeJS project cd custom URL shortener npm run go. So it's connected to both, and it should be running. So now back in VS Codes, in the requests folder, create a file named request.http, or whatever name you would like, as long as it has the .http file extension. Open that up, and inside of it, type the following code. The post URL, and then URL section, so post, and then the URL here, http://localhost 3000 or whatever port you had /API/URL/shorten. Tells it that we're sending a post request to the given URL, and then this tells us what type of content we are sending, and it tells it that it's of the type JSON, so content-type of application/JSON. Oops, just remove the first one if that happened to you. And then now down here, we send the actual JSON data. So we'll make a JSON target URL of whatever thing. So we can do http://example www.google.ca. And the target URL is the URL we want to redirect to, as mentioned in our code. So as long as you put in a real URL, it will add it to the database and send us back a success message with its assigned ID. To send it, at the top there will be a send request button if you installed the REST client plugin from part 1. As you can see, it sent us back an ID, so we can go to a web browser and go to send request. Oh, this isn't a valid ID. It isn't a valid URL. I'll be right back. I'm going to try and figure out why this is happening. So, I figured out why there was an issue with, and why it was thinking that target URL wasn't valid. The whole reason was simply because I had an extra line here. So if I have an extra line here, I save it and I send it. Oh, I have to run the server, of course. npm run go. I send the request. It is not valid. But if I go, because it doesn't register that it's this content type, JSON, so it doesn't understand it. But if I do that, and I send request, you see that it sent us back an ID, and all the correct stuff. Status code of 201 created, and yeah, it sent us back the thing. So if you see this short ID here and the target URL, if we go to a web browser and go http://localhost 3000 / the given ID, or this one in this case, and we go to that, it should redirect us to our target page, this site. This one, yeah, and that works. If we head back and add one more line, comma, short ID, and we provide it with an ID such as munch site, and we remove this and go like munch www.munch.codes, my site by the way, munch site, and we send the request. If you look at what it sends back, the short ID is munch site, and that's the one we sent. Because we sent that, and it's a custom one, it saved it as that. So if we go to our browser and replace the ID from before, so localhost with munch site, it will redirect us to the site. Voila. That's weird that it had that. It's still, I don't know. Yeah, but it redirects us to the site. So, yeah, it works. And we can even do custom ones. So, the last thing is that to show you is that if we do www.amazon.ca again, remove this, and we send that, it sends us back the same ID every time. It doesn't create a new one. Similarly, if we do short ID munch site, it won't overwrite it, but it will just say it's already in use. So we can save that, close that, and now if we go to MongoDB, which is the database, you can see if we go to collections, under collections here, and URL shortener DB short URLs, which was created by the model, you can see we have two different entries, and they are the two requests that we made. This one, Amazon, this, and my site with munch site as the ID. So yeah, it works. Very nice. Thanks for watching the third part of my URL Shortener tutorial series. Make sure that you hit subscribe and turn on your notification bell so you don't miss the next episode, in which we will cover how you can make two front-end web pages, on which in one of them a user can input a URL, and in the other one they can input both a URL and a custom ID, and both of those will return the shortened URL, similar to the requests we did, but not in a file on an actual web page. I hope to see you next time. But for now, goodbye.